Hello, career thought leaders. It's good to see you today. And we have Susan Chritton joining us again today to talk about personal branding and how we can use some of these concepts to really help people deal with all the negativity that's happening right now and the real and the perceived bad things that are going on in our economy. So, Susan, thanks for joining us.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So we talk about this and we love this topic, but I think I want to start with how do we talk about personal branding and how is that a little bit different than what most people talk about? So you talk about personal branding, you've been doing this for a really long time. How do you find that your version of it is different than what most people think it's going to be?
Yeah, I think that what I often see is people think personal branding is how you show up online, which it is. I mean, that is a piece of it. I think the piece that I see and the piece that I specialize in is really the who are you piece. Where do you fit in the world? Who's going to love those things about you? So to me, your personal brand is actually getting a lot more clarity about who you are in the and this is one of my latest in the last year, is that in the present moment, not just who you have been or who you will be, but who you are, and how does that help guide you into the future?
Yeah. And it's that really interesting deep dive that a lot of people don't do. Like you said, who you are, but then how do you connect? How do you connect who you are to the people that are going to hire you? And I think there's a lot of cliche phrases around about that. Find what you love, and you'll never work a day in your life. There's all these cliches, but when it comes right down to it, you find that a lot of people haven't really taken the time or energy to understand who they are and then how that's going to connect to the world. How do they get paid to do that?
Right. So first of all, I have four now adult children. I'm a pragmatist, so it's not, I think that that's a piece too, is that I think a lot of times people sell you fluff when they're thinking about personal branding, and they are things that are not actually very practical or realistic. And so I do really like to start with who the person is. And the reality is that there's a lot of places that who you are is really going to fit in the world if you start to look in the right places and not be, and this is my age old career development too. I've been doing that since the 90s. And, it's that place about there are places that are going to be good for you, places that are not going to be good for you, and the practical realities of, if this is a place that you need a job and you need to work, how do you then still maintain your humanity, your authenticity in that workplace, even if you're not doing work that you totally love or that you're hoping is, not a long-term gig.
Yeah. So let's talk about that first. We'll talk
Uh-huh,
about job change, but I don't know, it's been about a year that people have been
uh-huh,
talking about the big stay because we had the great resignation. Now we have the big stay where everyone's staying put because we're unsure about the election. We're watching the stock market go crazy in a bad way. So now they're talking about this. People feel like they have to stay. So how can these concepts help someone if they're stuck? What can they use from this to just be better, happier, more fulfilled where they are for a minute?
uh-huh, uh-huh. I mean, that's where a good career coach helps. The first thing that comes to mind is many years ago, I worked with this attorney, and she worked for a company out here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And she said, I like to go to the gym early in the morning, and I still get to work by 8:30, but everybody else has gotten there before me, 8-ish. And they all stare at me as I walk in the door. And she said, and that makes me hate my job. And she said, yet the fact that they all stare at me as I walk in the door. And to her, she said, part of how I get through my day is I like to go exercise first thing in the morning. That's where I'm being true to myself. And this isn't necessarily part of her personal brand, but it's part of her value system, right? Which is part of your personal brand. So one of the things we explored was, were there different entrances to her office? And she said, actually, if I park in the parking lot and I come up these stairs, I can come in the back and no one's going to stare at me. And so not that, but that was a workaround while she looked for other things. And so it was a way to make where she currently was not, a really unhappy place, but she knew that still wasn't her long-term, place. So I think a big piece too, and what part of the personal branding we teach at, career thought leaders is to really look at your values and what's important to you now. What are things that are the emotional currency of what you carry with your work? How does that influence how you make choices, how you show up? What do other people think about you? If you say you're all about community and you never volunteer, you never donate any money, you're not very true to that brand, as an example.
Yeah. I was just thinking as you were telling your story that one of the first things I did when I was in this job as a career counselor was did a session on job crafting for a small nonprofit that was really small. They're like 5 people. And it was like, well, how could we possibly let someone not do something so they could do more of what they like? But I find a lot of people have this very rigid idea of their job. But if you look for any opportunity, a lot of times there's an opportunity to do something that you might like to do. Sometimes it might be on top of what you're already doing, but sometimes it might not be. So thinking about what do I like to do? This is the who are you piece that personal branding dives into, because you've got to know that first. And a lot of people don't. What do you want more of? And then ask. Right? Ask your boss, are there any opportunities where I could do this, or any meetings I could sit in on where I might learn about that? And I just find that a lot of people don't take the time to do that, to really think about, okay, this is what I like to do,
Well,
and then have a conversation.
And I want to interject, not so much even ask your boss, because often your boss isn't very creative. So
Right.
I would say, in addition to ask your boss, come up with ideas and say, I would like to do X. And they may not have ever thought of it, and they might think it's a good idea. I used to do that in work all the time, and people would say, how did you get to do that? And I said, well, I asked.
Yeah.
And so some of that is, I have always been a teacher since I was, I don't know, the earliest I remember is, say, junior high. And so even in places where that wasn't a component of my job, I would start to run like lunch and learns and different things that I still got to be that piece of me.
Right. And I watch the other professional in my household. Right. He has this little built-in career coach, and he's worked with you. So he has that too. And he'll say, well, I know I like to do this. And then he'll tell his boss, well, I'd like to sit in on that meeting about this project. And sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't, but at least you have some ideas. And now your boss has an idea of what you do like to do, what you are interested in. And sometimes, like you said, you ask, or you at least initiate that conversation of, these are the things I like to do. And that's the start of it, is knowing what that looks like and then having that conversation.
I want to go back to something you started with and sort of contradicted a little bit. And you talk about, in this economy, I have been doing this work for 30 years. That is a phrase I've heard for 30 years. Good economy, bad economy, everyone always says in this economy. And so I caution people to go there, because even when, so the worst I ever saw it in my career was probably the early 2000s in the Bay Area. We had this huge tech downturn. And at that time, there was a 25% unemployment in Silicon Valley. I mean, that's really high, right? And people felt like no one was hiring. And there were still clients of mine that were creative and got jobs. And we came up with all kinds of other things. And they were, and it's, so there's always, there are difficulties, there are uncertainties. We're in the summer period. Things are always slow in the summer. So I always think if it takes 3 weeks in the fall, it takes 6 or 8 in the summer. I mean, it's a slower time. And I think always when we have elections coming up, there's a lot of uncertainty. And certainly around the elections over the last so many years, they have gotten more and more fearful based. And I think that permeates into people feeling uncertain.
Well, and I was saying this to a group the other day. I know the last year, 2 years, we've gone into this anti-hustle culture and work-life balance, but work-life balance is about sometimes work is gonna be more, and sometimes
Mhm,
life is gonna be more. It's not about that you're gonna find this balance. And so I think for right now, there might be a hustle for
mhm,
people where you've got to hustle, you might have to do a side hustle. What we're talking about is kind of hustling inside of work, taking on
mhm,
additional projects or attending additional meetings so that you can get visibility and have maybe some other things you like to do in your sphere. And I think that we've got to say, okay, right now I might be in a little bit of a time of hustle. And when will I know that I need to get out of that hustle? Because that's we don't want to get stuck in the hustle. But
mhm,
you I don't know, this is bad. It's a bad reference, but hustle and
yeah,
flow, whatever you want to
yeah,
say. Like right now, we've got some people that are maybe need to be in that space, and it's not going to be forever. Like you said, things will pick back up again, and what we can do with that. So John says that some bosses are cool, but people might be held down by their bosses. So we could go there. So what would you say if someone wants to do something else in their job, they don't feel like they could ask their boss or tell their boss?
So another place that not everything has to be fulfilled at work. Let me just say that. So personal brand, and since that's our general topic here, it extends to all of your life. So there may be for a lot of years too, when my kids were little, I was not in a leadership role, and I like being in a leadership role. So I took on leadership roles in my professional associations and in my community activities and some different things like that. So that was fulfilling for me, even though it wasn't necessarily work related. And to his point, I remember working for this one company and thinking, this is just okay. I actually have more ambition than this, but given where my kids are at, where I'm at, this is fine. And I will come up with some little side projects that didn't threaten anyone, right? That looked like it enhanced the work and it didn't, because I often found too, to answer John's question, right, is that sometimes your enthusiasm to show different parts of yourself can be threatening to your bosses. Certainly, we've both been there. Right. So I think there's that place of, again, coming up with little things that might move into bigger things as they're more and more successful, and always looking at it in a way, when you're trying to sell it to your boss, of how are you in service to the company, to helping them, to making their life easier. You often have to make it your boss's idea. Exactly, John. Right? Sort of like,
I love
being married to my husband. Sometimes I have to make it feel like his idea. But exactly.
Yeah. Well, and I was thinking too, you mentioned volunteering. I think people, although we talk about it a lot, don't ever stop talking about professional associations and that opportunity because just you
Mhm,
might be stuck at work, but if you still want to stay in the same industry, getting involved in your professional association be a way to meet people at other companies so that when there
mhm,
are more openings, you already have that network and to
mhm,
gain skill sets and leadership and all of those that you might not be able to gain at work. So
mhm,
the community activities and professional associations, keep talking about those career folks because I know
mhm.
we talk about it, but I think it's something that every client needs to hear that they're probably not thinking about unless you say it.
Mhm. And I've also seen, in the last, I don't know, so many years too, the emergence of, these employee resource groups. Like they've gotten stronger and stronger within companies, and that's an excellent way too, where it's, company sanctioned. They're always looking for people to jump in and do things there. And it's a really nice way to get visibility for more senior leadership, doing things that are of service. I had as you know, Marie, a big contract last year where I worked with a women at, big pharmaceutical company across globally. And so each one of their little groups geographically, and it was amazing how they started working more with each other and they got to know each other in a different way. And so that's a really nice way to build your brand as well.
Yeah, I think that that's people don't think about those groups, the opportunities,
Mhm, mhm,
all the ways that they can get engaged with that. Okay, so we've got that. We've talked about people who feel stuck. We've got a question here, so we're going to pivot.
Mhm. Okay.
Betsy, talking about young adults, how do they start building their personal brand?
So, sometimes it's hard because people think, oh, you have to be a certain age to build a personal brand. And I think from the time we're young people, right? We have things we like, we have things we don't like, and so what are things that you want to be known for? And I think the first step in any building of any personal brand, no matter what age, is having an awareness of who you are and what it is you have to offer, and not try to start too big. So I would say with a young person, and by all means, Marie, chime in on this, is that for a young person, pick one or two things that you say, I'm really good at this and I want people to know that about me. How do I, again, volunteer that? Or this is crazy, but my husband in his semi-retirement works as a lifeguard with all these teenagers, and he has an opinion about each one of them and their work ethic and their ability. They sometimes run their college essays by him, and things they want to say about that. And so I do think that you find those things that um, you're interested in, and develop a little bit of a point of view about it and start to have that show up a little bit more. And by all means, Marie, anything else you want to add with that?
Well, I think that our teachers and our parents could probably help us pretty quickly identify those threads, right? We always talk
Mhm.
about what are those threads, and you said, what do you want to be known for, which is, kind of the essence of personal branding. But even as a high schooler, and maybe even a
Mhm.
junior higher, I can think
Mhm.
about how I already had those threads.
Mhm.
Um, and if someone would have helped me perhaps put them together a little bit faster. And sometimes young people need reinforcement that those threads are okay. So one of my
Mhm.
threads, as you know, Susan, is I'm rebellious, and I was rebellious starting in the first grade, maybe kindergarten. And
Mhm.
in some concepts, you see that that's a negative. And I wish that someone could have helped me a little bit faster figure out how that could be a positive, or how I could turn that into a positive, because it was such
You
it was
mean
such a
like being
powerful
an
thing.
entrepreneur?
Right, right, exactly. But it took a really long time to get there. So
Right.
I would say for those young people, they probably already know what the threads are, but they may have been told that those threads are negative, and that's really not helpful when you've got a part of your personality that is, it's there,
Mhm.
it's obvious. How can we figure out how to make it into a positive? Obviously, if it's something that's seriously negative, they might need help with that. But a lot of times these things are positive, they just didn't fit into this, K through 12 school system or whatever it might be. And so, Betsy, I would say that I know I'm not alone, that a lot of young people need help saying, okay, here's your threads, and this is awesome about you.
Right.
How can we
Now,
help you use that to shine?
so I'm just thinking of somebody that my husband came home and told me about from the pool the other day. He said this young man is going into his sophomore year of college, and he's like, I'm so great. I do this, I do that, and all these things. And my husband goes, he's like the worst lifeguard we've got. He barely shows up on time. He is arrogant. He won't actually get up and help anybody. So he can talk whatever he wants to talk, and I'm sure he puts it all on social media, but when I watch what his actions are, they are not congruent with what he says about himself. And and so I think that's another piece, Betsy, that I would say with this too, is that what are those consistent threads, the things that you not only do say but do, and you part of a good personal brand is you can't be they can't be incongruent. Your actions need to align with your words, with the way you're representing yourself, and it doesn't have to be in a really big way. It can start small.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's that from the inside out. And I
Mhm.
think that that's the piece of it that students feel like they're kind of waiting for validation. I have to have a job or someone has to hire me to do this before it's part of my brand. And that's not necessarily true, right? You're pulling those things from the inside out, what has shown up over and over again in your interactions with people, your classrooms, your projects. That's what you want to pull from the inside out, rather than making them wait for external validation that that is their brand. Just because someone hasn't hired you to do that doesn't mean that's not true about you, perhaps. Okay, so Arthur says part of branding is being visible, not necessarily online, but being visible. So people are remote or hybrid. How can they have more engagement to show their brand?
Well, starter, turn on your camera. Like, I was amazed at when I worked with these women these groups, how many women wouldn't turn on, and these were the people, not necessarily men or women, but how many people didn't turn on their cameras? It's like, how on earth are we going to build your brand when you can't even see you? And so, and that sounds so obvious. Like sometimes I feel like the things that I say are just good common sense, but when you are working in a hybrid way, you have to work extra hard to be seen, to be noticed, to be thought of. You show up to all your meetings, you show up on video. If it is a hybrid workspace, you go into the office and you be seen on your 2 or 3 days a week. I have recently had a client who worked for Kaiser Permanente out here, the big medical group. And she said, we've been remote since COVID and we didn't have to go back. And she was talking about how she just doesn't feel seen. And I said, is there an office to go to? She said, there is. And I said, okay. So part of our plan was for her to go in at least twice a month and just spend a day. She goes, well, what if nobody's really even there? And I said, well, there's probably days more people are there than not. And so she goes, well, I get more done at home. I said, okay, but you're saying no one's recognizing you. No one's acknowledging you except for your twice a year in-person meetings. And I said, if you really want to be noticed, you're going to have to start to show up in a bigger way.
Yeah. And Karen says, contribute to meetings, right? Ask questions, be in the chat if there's a chat, or be in the conversation if there's a conversation. I think that's one of the things so many people feel intimidated, or, oh, I don't know what to ask. Well, let's work on that. How could you prepare a little bit more so that you feel comfortable? I know a lot of introverted people, they take longer to process. And so we might have to work on that. How can you ask that question? When would be an appropriate time? What happens if you think of a question later and they're in a different part of the meeting? You could still send that question to someone even though it's delayed. So we say, oh, I can't ask that because that was 10 minutes ago that we were talking about that topic. It's like, no, you can still have the conversation and contribute even if you're a little bit slower to process. That's fine.
And one of the things I always say too to my introverted clients is that if you need some time to process, ask for the agenda early. Because a lot of times the manager knows in general what they're going to talk about, for example. So you ask for the agenda early so you can be thinking about it, so you can contribute more in real time.
Well, there might be other things you could pay attention to that you aren't. Is there company communications that are coming out on a regular basis? Are you reading those? Are you paying attention to them? What are the other ways that
Are you doing this while you're in a meeting?
Right. Are you really even paying attention, or are you multitasking? Because then that makes it really hard to contribute if you're trying to multitask. I love that. But back to the remote hybrid. So we've talked about go in, be visible, ask whatever, ask questions. The other thing I was thinking about is if there is an invitation to do something, do it. So I know that again, we go back to that work-life balance and say no. That no is for something that's not aligned with what you want to do. So if you're trying to be more visible at work and an opportunity comes up to be more visible, you want to think about that a little differently. Like, yeah, you have all these other things to do. Like you were saying, the person's head down working. one, we've got to realize that that's not what's going to get us where we want to go. That's an old belief that if I do great work, I'll get promoted. And now we know that that's really just not how it works, unfortunately. So if you get an
you still have to
opportunity,
do good work, but you have to
right.
do other things. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can't do lousy work and just be social.
Although some people seem to get away with it. It's probably not a best practice. Yeah. But just thinking a little bit about, yes, we want to protect our time and those types of things, but you're saying no to the things that don't matter so that you have time to say yes to the things that do matter. So if you've identified that this is something that's important to you, say yes. My husband works remotely and he'll get invited to these meetings at the main office. And every time it's yes, we'll figure it out, right? We'll find childcare, we'll figure it out. Because if there's that opportunity to get in front of people in a meeting, that's where you want to be, and we'll make it work.
One of the things, and we haven't talked about this, is how does personal branding come into play in a transition? And I don't know if that's something, but just briefly, I want to just say I do a lot of work with people in that transition space, and it's kind of a hard time to do personal branding in one sense, because you're not feeling maybe as positive about everything, because transition's a funky time, right? When you're in this place. But what I would say is it goes back to the core of what personal branding is all about, which is you go to your core, you go to who are you, regardless of what you call yourself on the outside, regardless of the position you're doing. And you take, and I always feel if a person can really work in that space of who they are, they can get through transition in a better way, where they feel more positive and can make better choices about opportunities.
Yeah, I consider it like your roots. So your brand is your roots, and a tree that has really good roots can sway in the wind, right? It can figure out where it's going during transition, but it doesn't lose those roots. I remember like a year and a half ago or something, there was a huge storm when we were living in Utah, and all of these trees fell down, these really big trees, because they had really shallow roots. And so there was just hundreds of these big trees. I don't remember what brand, I don't remember what species they were, but they all fell down because they had shallow roots. And that's what I think about with personal branding, is people think, oh, I've got to be flexible. But to be flexible, you have to have that depth of understanding who you are, so that as you transition, you can still do it in a way where you come across as authentic and connected, and all of those things that attract people to you, because you've got that really core understanding of who you are. What you expect of yourself. Karen said this, that there's comfort in knowing what you expect of yourself and being able to articulate that to the employer. Yeah. And this is why we're talking about branding today, is because when we're in transition, when we're in tough economy, when we're in this negative space, that having that root system is really what can keep us sane. Right? I know who I am, and I'll find a space to land when things shake out.
Right. And that you are able to also, I think, have better discernment, right, as some of your choices and everything. So
yeah, in what you choose to do and what you don't choose to do. So we have our personal branding strategist class coming up here in a week. Tell me, what are some of your favorite things that you've seen from students? So maybe just one or two student stories, because I know that this gives people a process to work with their clients. But one of the other things we also see is the transformation of the people in the class.
Yeah. So this last class we had, one of the people right after the class, like she came up with all kinds of kind of really interesting ways to think about herself and how to present herself. And boom, within like a week, remember, she was on like a TV thing, and they were doing something in the plaza near her work. And next thing you know, she's like the lead person in this story. And she just could explain who she was in a really nice way. But I think the parts I really love is that the students who are my peers, my profession, they're all professionals, get clear on who they are. They often really love to work with their buddies. I've seen them have some really great friendships. There's even a group that started a little business together out of it. And I think the parts I really like, it feels safe to explore and say, well, how does that really sound? I don't know how I live that. And it's a really safe space to ask those questions, not only for themselves, but to think about how they may guide a client through that as well.
Right. And it's that opportunity. It's hard to talk about a process if you haven't experienced it. So they get to experience the personal branding process and see how, even though they may know who they are, see how the process can deepen that. And then we do work on the target audience of who is your target audience.
Right.
And you don't have to be in business to go in this class. We have university career professionals that go through it too. But you get this idea of, okay, who am I trying to connect with? And what am I trying to share about myself that connects with them? And then how do I help a client figure that out too?
You know, we even had that man who owned a big insurance agency, and he did it to work on the brand of his insurance agency and then to roll it out with all his employees. So it was an interesting, we do get all kinds of people in the class. It's not necessarily just coaches, but I do think it's a wonderful tool to work with your clients, right?
Yes, and it does go beyond job search because we're talking about how do you help people know who they are and communicate that. So we have people who have that train or that work with leaders, work with small business owners, right? It's not just about job search either.
Right.
And
I worked on a 9-year project for a professional services firm on their personal brands. So, you know, that's a really great audience as well.
Yeah, leaders.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing. This was a fun conversation, and thank all of you for your comments and questions. That made it very rich. Arthur and John and Karen and Betsy.
And you know, I blew in from my beehives. I was out with my beehives. So
well, it was so hot here today. My face is all red. I think I got sunburned walking around with the kids. But all right. Well, it was great chatting with you, Susan, and thank you so much for joining us. And we'll be back next Tuesday for more of the Now, the New, and the Next in careers. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.